All right. Well, good morning and welcome. This is a recording for the Community for Justice and Equality Advocates. We're a community of healthcare practitioners, physicians, employees at Sutter Health who aim to foster meaningful conversations and actions around human rights, equality, and justice with a special focus on health disparities and global health. With that, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Professor Peter Beinart, who's a professor of journalism and political science at CUNY, the editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, and the author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack with over 20,000 followers. Peter, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I understand that, from your work, you have a special interest in studying and speaking on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that you have experience with this, having visited Israel. Can you give us a little bit of background on your experience, your perspective with Israel, Palestine, the occupation, and also kind of unpack for us how your American identity and also your Jewish identity has informed your understanding of this conflict and how it shaped your perspective?
Gosh, there's a lot there. I mean, I would say I, like many Jews of my generation, certainly grew up with a strong sense that Israel, a Jewish state, a state that had a special obligation to Jews that was beyond its obligation to the other people under its control, the Palestinians, was the kind of guarantor of Jewish safety, given a long history of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust. I think because my family, the particular circumstances of my family, particularly my grandmother, who had been born in Egypt and then gone to the Belgian Congo and then gone to South Africa, that sense of transience and being uprooted, I think particularly for her, meant that the existence of a Jewish state was a kind of security, even though she didn't actually live there. And I think many other Jews have felt that way. It was only really in my adulthood that I had been to Israel many times, but it was only really in my adulthood, I'm somewhat embarrassed to say, that I really began to interact with Palestinians when I went to Israel, when I went to the West Bank for the first time. And it was only subsequent to that I really began to read Palestinian writing and see Palestinian films and really begin a kind of conversation, which was really more just kind of listening to the Palestinian experience. Because as Edward Said famously said, Zionism has meant as much to Palestinians as it is meant to Jews, but just in a very different way. And while many Jews, perhaps most Jews, have seen Zionism as a kind of national liberation, for Palestinians, it's been a movement of dispossession, starting, in 1917, when the British essentially said that they would support the existence of a Jewish state in a population where the vast majority of people were Palestinian Arabs, leading to 1948, when Israel was created in an act of the expulsion of more than half of the Palestinian population, continuing in 1967, when Israel creates a military occupation over millions of Palestinians, and to this day, when Israel holds Gaza under a blockade with Egyptian help, that has turned Gaza into what Human Rights Watch calls an open-air prison. And the view that I have come to is that actually Jewish safety and Palestinian safety are deeply intertwined, and that without Palestinian freedom, the ability for Palestinians to have the same basic rights that we would all want, which starts with citizenship, either in an independent Palestinian state or in the one state that Israel has created between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. Without that freedom, Palestinians are subjected to tremendous amounts of violence. And that violence can sometimes be invisible to Jews and to other people in the United States because it's not necessarily on our television screens. But when you go to the West Bank or East Jerusalem, you see the magnitude of the violence, which is inherent in being controlled by a state that has no obligations to you. States, the only protections we have against states are our rights. And when people don't have those rights vis-a-vis a state because they're not citizens, they can't vote for the state that controls their lives, they're subject to tremendous violence. And then tragically, that violence in various ways also can be manifested against Israeli Jews. That is not by any means a justification of what Hamas did on October 7th, which I think was an atrocious war crime, a massive human rights violation. But my view is that to prevent future October 7th and to prevent violence against both Israeli Jews and Palestinians, that the question of Palestinian freedom has to be at the core, and it's only with Palestinian freedom that you can have a safe mutual coexistence between two peoples.
Beautiful. So in some ways, this sounds a lot like a civil rights issue. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates has said that his experience has mirrored much of what he's seen in segregation in the United States. Is that the angle that you see there with regards to Israel really controlling and dominating Palestinian lives and them not having a state of their own?
There are some important differences between Israel, Palestine, and the United States, or the condition of Black Americans in the United States. One of which is that in Israel, you have two national identities. Jews and Palestinians, although Judaism is a religion, Israeli Jews are also a people who desire self-determination, as do Palestinians. And that's why I think that even if there were to be one equal state where everyone was equal under the law, it would need to be binational. It would need to recognize in some sense that the national characters of these two peoples, like, say, Belgium does or Canada does with Quebec. The Black struggle in the United States is somewhat different because although there were some Black nationalists who saw Black people as a separate nation, the mainstream thrust was for equality within the American national identity. But where I agree with Ta-Nehisi Coates is that that when you hold people under a fundamentally different set of laws, as Israel does in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and even some ways even inside Israel proper, then what that affects every aspect of someone's life. So I think what Coates was showing a kind of sense of recognition of was that Palestinians in Israel, in the West Bank, live alongside Israeli Jews, but with a fundamentally different set of rights. The Israeli Jews are citizens. They have due process. They have free movement. They have the right to vote. And Palestinians have none of those things. And when you don't have those things, it impacts every aspect of your life in a very profoundly negative and dehumanizing way. And I think that's what Ta-Nehisi Coates was referring to.
Do you think that there's credence to what some people label the situation there as apartheid?
Yes, I do. This was a term that Palestinians, first of all, it's important to say that although apartheid is an Afrikaans word, it means apartness in the language of Afrikaans. So of course, it comes out of South Africa. It has a broader international legal definition. So something doesn't have to be identical to what happened in apartheid South Africa, right? And we kind of recognize this in the sense that we might have called the Jim Crow South apartheid too, even though it wasn't exactly the same as apartheid South Africa. I think the fundamental international legal definition means kind of legalized domination or oppression by one group over another. And in the West Bank, that's certainly true because, again, Jews have a whole set of rights that their Palestinian neighbors don't have. It's also true in East Jerusalem. It's a little bit more complicated inside Israel proper, where Palestinian citizens, who are sometimes called Arab Israelis, do have the right to vote. But even then, it's very much a second-class citizenship, as you can see, for instance, in the fact that the Israel Land Authority, which controls most of the land inside Israel proper, gives almost half of its seats to the Jewish National Fund, which essentially distributes land almost exclusively for Jewish use, which is why Palestinian citizens are 20% of the population, but live on 2 or 3% of the land. So this is why international human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have essentially caught up to Palestinians and said that they also use this term. But not only that, also Israel's two most prominent human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, have themselves started to use the term apartheid and says that it applies.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you with regards to your perspective on what happened on October 7th in Israel, if you can kind of help us understand what happened there, give us a brief overview of the situation in Gaza and the occupied territories since October 7th. You kind of touched on a little bit about why that happened, and without addressing those issues, that this would continue to recur. Israel has resumed hostilities in the Gaza Strip. Do you think that this can be, their objectives can be militarily solved.
Right. So when I'm discussing October 6th, I think it's really important to draw a very clear distinction between giving context and making a moral justification.
Mhm.
I do not and will never make any moral justification for what Hamas did, because I fundamentally believe that no matter what person is subject to, they still have moral responsibility for their actions, right? And so the moral responsibility to go into kibbutz Be'eri or kibbutz or the other towns and southern villages and kill civilians, that is the moral responsibility for that lies on the people who did it and the people who ordered that attack, the Hamas leaders, irrespective of the context, right? I mean, to take a more extreme example, even if someone walked out of a concentration camp in 1945 at the end of the Holocaust and walked into the home of a German person and shot that German civilian dead, they would be morally responsible for that action regardless of what they had gone through. So I want to be clear about that.
Sure,
That said, if we want to make sure that these kind of things don't happen, we have to understand the context. And the contexts are, first of all, that most of the people in Gaza, the context starts long before the creation of Hamas. Hamas was only created in 1987. It starts with the fact that most of the people in Gaza are from refugee families. They're not from Gaza. One of the reasons Gaza is so overcrowded is that many people who would have been from what's now southern and central Israel basically were expelled or fled in fear to the Gaza Strip behind Egyptian lines when Israel's War of Independence ended in 1940 and 1949. And so those people have a desire to return to their homes. In a way, the fundamental problem that Israel's always had with Gaza, long before Hamas existed, is that simple fact that those people want to return. Sometimes they can even see their lands from the Gaza Strip.
the
And that
refugees.
desire to return is a human desire. It's not a pathological desire. It's, I think, what almost any of us, especially Jews, ironically, who pride ourselves on having never forgotten what we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, for 2,000 years. Surely we can understand why Palestinians wouldn't just give up on the places that they were forced to flee from or expelled from 75 years ago. So that's the first thing. Secondly, when Israel won the 1967 war, it took the Gaza Strip from Egypt and put it under occupation, where Palestinians were under Israeli control, but didn't have basic rights, the citizenship, the right to vote. Then Israel withdrew its settlements from Gaza, but put Gaza under blockade. There had already been some control, and it tightened after the election of Hamas. There was an election in 2006 in parliamentary elections that Hamas won. It won a majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. Now, we don't have time to go too deeply into the history, but my argument would be that Hamas is an Islamist movement. Most in the Palestinian national politics, just like in many Arab countries, you have a kind of leftist or communist tradition, you have a nationalist tradition, and you have an Islamist tradition, right? And Hamas rejected when the PLO, the nationalist umbrella organization, accepted Israel's existence in 1988 and began the Oslo process. Hamas refused to and rejected it. One of the things that I think and then committed suicide bombings against Israelis in the 90s, one of the things that has empowered Hamas, I believe, is the sense among Palestinians that their other strategies have failed. So one of the things that I think is really important, if one like me doesn't, Hamas has a set of values that are antithetical to mine. I believe in a secular liberal state. It does not. I believe that one must resist in an ethical way, not against civilians. Hamas does not. But one of the reasons that Hamas has grown stronger is that Israel and the United States have effectively defeated and stopped Palestinian resistance, which is ethical and does imagine kind of mutual coexistence. So when Palestinians have gone to the United Nations or the International Criminal Court, they have been stopped. The U.S. actually said it would defund the International Criminal Court. When the PLO and Fatah started working alongside Israel in the West Bank to prevent attacks on Israelis in the hope that they would reassure Israel that Palestinians could be trusted with their own state, Israel continued to build settlement growth so that Palestinians began to feel like that effort was a failure. When Palestinians called for boycotts and sanctions, which are nonviolent efforts, those efforts have been essentially almost criminalized in the United States. So my point would be, if you want to weaken Hamas, I don't think you could ever destroy Hamas, but if you want to weaken Hamas and make sure that it doesn't have that it makes it harder for it to do what it did on October 7th again, which I hope we never ever see again, we have to strengthen those Palestinians who are resisting ethically with a vision of mutual coexistence. And time and again, we've done the opposite. And what I fear, I'll stop with this, is that Israel may be able to kill a lot of Hamas fighters, and it may be able to destroy a lot of Hamas weaponry. But what it's going to leave in its wake in the Gaza Strip will be many, many more people who feel no horizon for Palestinian freedom and are so traumatized and enraged by what has happened to them that will be the next generation of people who try to kill Israeli Jews. We know that Hamas recruits its fighters from the families of people that Israel has killed. If Israel tries to reoccupy Gaza, or I think, frankly, put anyone in charge in Gaza, I think there will be an insurgency like the US faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. That government will not be legitimate. And the security that Israelis crave, I believe they will not ultimately get, because the only true path to security goes through Palestinian freedom.
I see. Thank you for that. With regards to Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip since October 7th, a lot of Holocaust and genocide scholars have come out either warning of genocide, accusing Israel of genocide, or saying, we face genocide. Let's address this proactively instead of retrospectively. There's been a lot of degrading language from Israeli authorities, citing, the prime minister calling the Palestinians Amalek from the Old Testament, animals, the New York Times saying that civilians are being killed at a historic pace. UNICEF calling this a war on children, the cutting off of food, electricity, water, and fuel, and the destruction of shelter. I think it's something like 50 or 60% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed. The healthcare system has been described by the World Health Organization as catastrophic. Do you think that the term genocide is an appropriate use here?
I haven't used the term genocide. I'm not an international legal scholar, and some of the people that I kind of would look to I would defer to on this, people like Omar Bartov at Brown, for instance, who's a pretty well-known Holocaust scholar, has spoken about this, has not used the term genocide as of now, nor have, for instance, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. But I do think there have been statements that are genocidal. For instance, the statement of Benjamin Netanyahu invoking Amalek. Anyone who is familiar with the Hebrew Bible knows that the injunction for the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, in the books of Exodus and the book of Samuel, and indeed even in the book of Esther, is to exterminate the Amalekites. And that's why Jewish tradition has very wisely, the rabbinic Judaism has always said, we do not know who the Amalekites are, to kind of defang this very, very dangerous biblical language. But Netanyahu essentially has overturned rabbinic Judaism and said in an incredibly hubristic statement that the rabbis would never have supported, I know who the Amalek is, and essentially brought back this very dangerous biblical language. And even if one doesn't need to believe that this constitutes a genocide to believe that it represents a kind of shocking slaughter and dislocation of people. I mean, by comparison, we have all been shocked by what happened in Ukraine. In Ukraine, 1/4 of people have been displaced from their homes. In Gaza, 3/4 of the population has been displaced from its home. The number of children who have been killed in Gaza has already surpassed the number of children killed in armed conflict around the entire world in the entire year of 2022. So it's an extraordinary scale of killing and destruction in that territory. And I think that is why it has kind of rightly shocked the conscience of a lot of people, especially Americans, given that in many cases, these are our weapons.
Thank you for that. One of the focuses of our group is healthcare, and the World Health Organization has recorded at least 187 attacks on healthcare. There have been 250 healthcare providers that have been killed, including 92 physicians, 80 nurses. Gaza has 35 hospitals. It's reported the latest estimate is that at least 26 hospitals are completely non-functional. Israel has asserted that Hamas operates out of these hospitals and framed its attack of El Shifa hospital in that sense. In other hospitals such as the Indonesian hospital, they didn't make that claim. Amnesty International has stated we have seen zero credible evidence that El Shifa hospital was being used for military purposes. Do you know of any substantial evidence that has been presented to support the claims that Hamas is operating out of centers of health?
I haven't looked into it. I would tend to kind of defer on this kind of issue to international human rights organizations, although it's difficult for them because they can't really operate in Gaza right now. I guess I would say a couple of things. First of all, Gaza is a very, very crowded space. It's one of the most crowded places in the world. So it's almost inevitable that you're going to have military and civilian, in fairly close proximity. The second thing is, it may turn out to be true that Hamas has embedded in various ways in civilian locations, maybe even in medical in locations as well. The truth is that when you think about insurgencies and the way insurgencies generally fight, the whole kind of premise of insurgencies tends to be that you embed yourself in among the civilian population. I mean, it wasn't like the Viet Cong when they were fighting, in South Vietnam when they were fighting the United States. They just walked out into the fields and said to the American planes, "Here we are." They were in the villages, right? Because they were weaker, and this was one of the ways in which they tried to kind of to deal with the imbalance of military firepower. This is not unique to Hamas. And so if it's in some ways, to me, the lesson that many of Israel's supporters take is, well, if Hamas is in civilian areas or even in medical areas, well, then we have no choice but basically to kill all the civilians. To me, the lesson is very different. It's that first of all, that there are rules of war. And secondly, it shows to me the fundamental problem with seeing this as a military solution. I think guerrilla insurgencies in general are very unlikely to be defeated militarily. There has to be a political solution, right, to the political grievances that any insurgent group is bringing forward. And so, to me, one of the things that tends to happen in this is that we kind of often exceptionalize Palestinians and suggest that kind of the way they are behaving is kind of fundamentally pathological and fundamentally different. The truth is, again, that this fighting among civilian populations is a pretty normal situation, and it's why the U.S. was such tremendous folly for the United States to try to treat Vietnam, for instance, as a military problem rather than a political problem. And I think it's the same. It's also why it's a folly for Israel to treat Palestinians and the people and Gaza fundamentally as a military rather than a political problem.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions here. There's some reluctance amongst journalist organizations, given there have been about 50 journalists killed, and medical organizations to engage in kind of a balanced public discourse on this, which, as you pointed out, it didn't really occur with Ukraine. I would say, number one, is there an imperative for professionals and organizations to show solidarity with these injustices? And I think I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I guess it depends on how different organizations consider their mission and their mandate. I mean, I do think there sometimes is a challenge for organizations of kind of, if they take a position on one issue, how do they distinguish between that and many other issues, right? There are kind of always terrible things that happen in the world. Some get more attention than others. So I think it's important that an institution create a set of kind of logical criteria that allows it to, not just in one case, but in general, kind of have a set of policies about when it comments that's kind of consistent, So I think that depends on the kind of the identity and the mission of each organization. But I do think that as individuals who are Americans, we have the right to ask questions about how our tax dollars are being used. It seems to me at the very least, does not seem to me a good use of American tax dollars. And I think that if the United States is going to give military aid to Israel, it should at least be military aid that's conditioned. We're supposed to have a law in the books called the Leahy Law, which says that the U.S. will not give military aid to the military of any unit of any military around the world that has been credibly accused of human rights violations. It seems to me we should apply that to Israel as we apply that to every country, and I think that would have an impact on U.S. policy, and I think it would also have an impact on Israeli behavior.
Peter, I think last question here. The House just passed a resolution equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and I think that's something that is frequently brought up in this context when discussing Palestinian rights, is the label and the accusation of anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts on this? How do you distinguish between legitimate critique of Israeli policies and anti-Semitism?
To me, the kind of critical question is, do you believe that both Jews and Palestinians deserve to live equally with safety and dignity in this land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan? If you say if your answer is yes, and you don't want it to be a Jewish state, so you're an anti-Zionist, but you want Jews and Palestinians to live equally, that to me is not bigotry. It's not anti-Semitism. How can it be bigotry if you're saying that people should be treated equally? If your view is that you want to expel the Israeli Jews, or God forbid, kill the Israeli Jews, or subjugate them or dominate them, yes, that may be anti-Semitism, just as I think it would be anti-Palestinian bigotry to say that Palestinians should be expelled or subjugated or oppressed. And so I think that it's true, sometimes anti-Zionists can be anti-Semites. Sometimes Zionists can be also anti-Semites. We have people around the world like Viktor Orban, the leader in Hungary, who, for instance, who loves Israel, but doesn't like Jews in his own country very much, partly because he wishes that he basically believes that Jews should be in their own country, not in his country. So that's a kind of Zionist anti-Semitism. So I think, it seems to me, it's important to understand that Palestinians have very understandable reasons to be anti-Zionist. Even if you believe Zionism was wonderful for Jews, it was not very good for Palestinians. It's been a pretty rough experience that Palestinians had with Zionism. And so if you say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you're saying that all Palestinians are bigots. They're all Jew haters. And if you say that, you are dehumanizing them, and you're essentially silencing them, and laying the foundation even for criminalizing their voices, which we see a lot happening in the United States. And that's why I find the equation so problematic.
I see. Peter, I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that we can have you again in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.